Good evening. We'll be starting in about a minute. Thank you for joining us this evening. The Chicago Lakefront is one of America's urban wonders. The ribbon of high-rise luxury apartment buildings along the Lake Michigan shore has few, if any, rivals nationwide. This historic confluence of site, money, style, and development lies at the heart of the updated edition of Neil Harris's Chicago Apartments, a century and beyond of lakefront luxury. My name is Scott Fortman, principal of the architectural firm of Gibbons Fortman and Associates, and president of the Chicago chapter of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. The ICAA is the leading national nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing the practice and appreciation of the classical and vernacular traditions in architecture and the allied arts. To do so, the ICAA offers a broad range of educational programs. These include intensives for architecture and design students, introductory programs for middle school students, lectures and walking tours for the public, continuing education courses for professionals and enthusiasts, travel programs to visit classical masterpieces, the publishing of original and reprinted books, and an annual journal entitled The Classicist. Through our national and regional award programs, the ICAA also honors contemporary leaders of classical design and the related fields. Our membership represents the diverse and dynamic cross-section of all those involved with the building arts, from architects and designers to patrons and artisans. The ICAA's focus is on traditional design principles that are universal: proportion, balance, scale, and beauty. Compositions inspired by nature and the human body, incorporating handcrafted materials and art that result in thoughtfully designed spaces that feel comfortable, familiar, and inspirational. We've had a full schedule of virtual programs this spring, and in April, we hope to premiere a short film, Behind a Designer's Eye, The Gardens of 900 with Craig Bergman, where Craig takes us on a tour of his gardens and tells the story of the coach house and two gatehouses designed by David Adler in 1917 for A. Watson Armour. We'll also be launching our annual design competition in May. We hope to return to some in-person programming this summer, and I'm happy to announce that we have scheduled our 9th annual Acanthus Awards for October 16th at the Wintrust Grand Banking Hall, provided conditions allow us to meet in person. Please visit our website at classicistchicago.org for more details on this and future events and the benefits of membership in the ICAA. I'm delighted to co-host tonight's presentation with the Benjamin Marshall Society. This is our third collaboration. The first was a presentation on the work of architect Stanley D. Anderson by Paul Bergman. The second was a presentation on Chicago's rich Art Deco history with author Kathleen Skolnick. I'd like to take a moment to introduce Jane Lepeau, president of the Benjamin Marshall Society, who was instrumental in putting this series together. Jane? Unmute, please. Thank you. You're still muted.
Unmute.
There you go.
Okay. I don't know. I don't see myself, but all right.
We can see you.
You can see me. Okay, great. Anyway, yes, I want to thank you for joining us for this fabulous event with Neil Harris. The Benjamin Marshall Society was founded in 2002, and we have come a long way in bringing Benjamin Marshall's name and legacy and works back to the lexicon of Chicago architectural history. One of the first lectures I went to on that spoke highly, in fact, spoke at all about Benjamin Marshall was Neil Harris's first book called Chicago Apartments, A Century of Lakefront Luxury. And indeed, Benjamin Marshall, who was a huge follower of Daniel Burnham, built all along the lakefront and was part of Burnham's City Beautiful project. I'm not going to say a lot except that what Scott said about what they are doing is very similar to what we are doing. We offer lectures, tours, visits to private residents, mostly Benjamin Marshall residences. And of course, we do bigger events and we do smaller events, meetups, when outside of COVID, of course. So this is all kind of new to us, and we are really delighted to have so many people follow us. It's just been wonderful. And so I would just like to say that we are planning many more events for not only live events, but also more webinars. And one of them, which is going to be very important for everyone who cares about Benjamin Marshall in particular, will take place on May 4th. Benjamin Marshall's birthday is May 5th. And so it's Cinco de Mayo. So we are going to we're going to have a lecture and show the film on Benjamin Marshall on May 4th. So everyone keep posted. There will be other webinars in between. And really, I'm just delighted to be collaborating with ICAA. And I want to thank you all for coming and for caring about Chicago and Chicago's architects, and particularly, of course, classical architecture, which is such a foundation of everything that follows. With that, I would just like to say that anyone interested in getting involved or even being on our mailing list needs to go to info@benjaminmarshallsociety.org. That's it. So with that, Scott, you can take it away.
Thanks, Jane. Now I'd like to introduce today's esteemed presenters. Neil Harris is the Preston and Sterling Morton Professor Emeritus of History and Art History at the University of Chicago, where he taught for 39 years. Mr. Harris has published widely on a variety of subjects: the artist in American society, humbug, the art of P.T. Barnum, cultural excursions, building lives, and the Chicagoan are among his books. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a former holder of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Getty Scholar, and has served on a series of institutional boards and committees. Of course, he is also the author, with the assistance of Terry Edelston, of Chicago Apartments, A Century and Beyond of Lakefront Luxury. Chicago Apartments features more than 100 buildings stretching from north to south and across more than a century, each with its own special combination of design choice, floor plans, and background story. Join me in welcoming author Neil Harris, who takes us on a tour of these beautiful buildings. Take it away, Neil.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for being part of this. Particular thanks, of course, to Scott, to Jane, to Julie Hayes, to ICAA and the Benjamin Marshall Society for hosting this. Again, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk. Almost 20 years ago, a New York publisher approached me with an idea. He had just done a lavish book on the legendary apartment house architect, Rosario Candela, creator of some of Manhattan's most luxurious buildings. He wondered whether Chicago contained anything like them. And I took this as a personal and geographical challenge. That was the origin of Chicago Apartments, a century of lakefront luxury. Partnering with my wife, Terry Edelstein, who will be joining me when the questions come in, and she did most of the hard work, we combined photographs, renderings, and floor plans for some of our most ambitious apartment buildings. In the first book, there were 99, in fact. Helped by friends in the archives of the Chicago History Museum and the Art Institute of Chicago, plus the remarkable photographs owned by Dave Phillips, we moved ahead. And I want to thank them again and all the foundations that supported that publication. The readership proved to be large and enthusiastic, building residents, relatives of residents, realtors, amateur historians, all sorts of devotees surfaced, many contacting us and even more purchasing copies. So within just 4 years, by 2008, a considerable run was exhausted. And I'm going to now go on to my PowerPoint, I hope, and actually start the slideshow as soon as I get that up. We were able to, as I say, sell many copies, and the book went out of print within just 4 years or so. While reprinting was expensive, it seemed like a good idea to bring out another edition. And here we were helped by the Terra Foundation, the BMO Harris Bank, and the Driehaus Foundation. And I want to take this moment to remember Richard Driehaus, who I think many of us knew, and how extraordinary his influence was in this city and beyond in areas of classical architecture. The new edition would allow me and Terry to correct some errors, and more than that, acknowledge changes in living style. Luxury, it turns out, is not static, and here you see the cover of the new edition. Definitions and desires evolve, so we took another look. We kept the book's black and white format to preserve its unity and its history, and you'll be seeing mainly black and white images tonight. We wanted to retain an emphasis on those opulent high-rises of the 1920s, but we moved beyond them to much later times and newer buildings. We are happy to have this opportunity to do that. A bit of context. By the 1920s, apartment houses had only recently become legit in this country. Many thought respectable family life was possible only in houses. Sharing walls was fine, but sharing entrances was not. And here you see a stretch of townhouses in New York, paralleled by some in Chicago. Flat life, while popular in Europe, was tarred by its association with tenements. And even worse was hotel living, which suggested ostentation and low morals. Ironically, in Illinois, the only way to incorporate an apartment house project was to call it a hotel. So apartment houses could be built only by individual speculators or partnerships at this time. So the oldest apartment building in our book is the Hotel St. Benedict Flats on East Chicago Avenue, put up in the 1880s. Actually, the St. Benedict resembles in many ways a string of townhouses. Here you can see a contemporary photograph from across the street. Its elaborate ornamental details, which are still worth looking at, surround a series of separate entries. So the illusion of separation remains. Tastes were already changing, however, by this time. Baron Haussmann had transformed Paris into a city of apartment houses, controlled by uniform height and festooned with lively neoclassic facades, many of them facing the grand boulevards. Since Paris supposedly was where good Americans go after they die, these 6- and 7-story piles began to exert greater appeal. And in fact, some early apartment buildings were called French flats to acknowledge their inspiration. Americans did make one major addition, the elevator. Visitors to Paris know, to their discomfort, those oddly shaped and tiny moving cylinders, which are usually retrofitted into French stairwells. Placed next to often elegant staircases, the ascenseur looked like a desperate afterthought. Guests with luggage find them a particular challenge. But here, elevators were placed in anything higher than 4 or 5 stories. Chicagoans disliked climbing stairs, as New Yorkers did, and paneled attended elevators would soon be a feature of grander buildings, many of them with a bench so that those inside could rest on their ascent. The elevator was important, however, for another reason. It increased social segregation. The uppermost floors of Paris apartment buildings were supposedly occupied by starving artists, the poor, or servants who trudged the stairs to rooftop garrets. And here you see the upper stories of one of these buildings. The most desirable apartments with high ceilings and spacious floor plans occupied the lower floors. American elevators made the upper floors even more appealing than the lower. No one could reside in these grand buildings unless they could afford the high charges. The clientele would be largely homogeneous by race, religion, and class, and this was enforced by the residents of many of these buildings. Manhattan, with constricted land availability, led with large apartment buildings in the late 19th century. Some are legendary, like the Dakota, which you see here, built by Henry Hardenberg, the architect of the Plaza Hotel, in the 1880s, but there were soon many others, like the 2,500-room Ansonia on Broadway, or the Navarro Flats on Central Park South, but nothing on this scale appeared here. Here you can see the Doralton still standing in New York in built in 1902. Chicago apartments of this era tended to be smaller and more restrained in character. The Argyle Apartments, 1886, by Burnham and Root on West Jackson, or on the right, 1210 North Astor, still standing, of 1897 by Holabird and Roche. Or to take another, and that's in the book, as well as the Brewster at 2800 North Pine Grove, substantial, spacious, comfortable, but not the overpowering Rococo-like masses that crowded Manhattan's west side. Just before World War I, change came. While several architects contributed, one was truly decisive, and the supreme master of the grand hotel and apartment house emerged with Benjamin Marshall. Height, location, ambition, and expense combined to make these Marshall buildings special. Here you can see a Marshall, photographs of the young Marshall, and a caricature of him by Dean Markey in the Chicagoan in the 1920s. I hesitate to say a lot about Benjamin Marshall with so many local experts watching. New scholarship, a film, a society, a biography, all have refocused attention on his special talents. His flamboyant and glamorous personal life, his notable hotels like the Drake, the Blackstone, the Edgewater Beach, and his apartment buildings were revelatory. Most of them survive. Combining axial Beaux-Arts planning with wonderful classical detailing. Here you can see a detail of one of the early Marshall apartment buildings, the Stewart, 1200 North Lakeshore Drive. Building on prominent sites on or near the lakeshore, his office produced some remarkable projects. Here you can see in a lonely splendor on the eve of World War I, his early buildings, 199 East Lakeshore Drive on the right, and his the first of these, 999 North Lakeshore Drive on the left. These buildings contained Marshall signatures, large, elegant, high-ceiling apartments with many rooms, multiple fireplaces, grand views, and sometimes bow windows, which you can see here to the right at 199. 199 was actually built in two parts. An annex with duplexes was added just 4 years after completion of the first portion. Both characteristically were speculations put up by individual investors, in one case, Marshall himself, to be rented out at impressive prices. Further north, at just about the same time, Marshall completed another, even more significant apartment building at 1515 North State, important for several reasons. First of all, its 12 stories stretch the upper limit for buildings of its type here. Second, its full floor apartments, 8,000 square feet or almost that, set new standards for space. The public rooms stretched across more than 100 feet. The servants' quarters included their own dining room. And that was a bit unusual, but nevertheless a Marshall feature, as were the floor plans in French, adding distinction. Third, the impressive rental fees, somewhere between $8,000 and $9,000 annually in 1912. In today's terms, that is close to $200,000, more than $15,000 a month, a hefty figure even now. Soon after the building opened, its tenants, fearing an even heftier rent increase, banded together and bought the building from Marshall, who needed cash for the Edgewater beach developments further north on Sheridan Road. This was not Chicago's first cooperative, but was its most prominent. By the time America entered World War I, Chicago contained a number of luxurious flat buildings, many of them on the north side, but several, like 5490 South Shore Drive, the Jackson Shore, on the south side. This building was designed by George and Cornelius Rapp, the builders of many important downtown movie palaces here and elsewhere. 5490 is also interesting because its elaborate selling brochure has survived. The text and the pictures suggest the appeals that luxury buildings held for prospective residents: extensive services, proximity to the lakefront, sweeping views, and handsome layouts. These brochures, gathered together in the 1920s and 30s by an architect, are housed in the Burnham Library at the Art Institute. And some of them are superb pieces of printing design. They were really fundamental to the book, Chicago Apartments, and their recovery was very exciting. At 12 stories, 5490 was about as high as Marshall's 1550 North State, but it had 2 apartments to a floor. So although these are extremely large, they were a bit less spacious than Marshall's version. The same year that 5490 was completed, in 1917, 2 Chicago realtors, A.J. Partridge and Harold Bradley, published their guide to Chicago luxury apartments entitled A Directory to Apartments of the Better Class. The floor plans and photographs remain a mine of information, and this book has actually been reprinted. But only 18 of their 68 buildings contained more than 6 floors, and none went beyond 12. Still, some of these apartments featured great luxuries, wine closets, silver safes, large quantities of marble and mahogany were featured. And on the left, you see the Lincoln Park West building that we have included in the new edition. More change was coming, more dramatic change. 11 years later, in 1928, Baird and Warner published its own guide demonstrating that a real revolution had taken place. A portfolio of fine apartment homes is a testament to the construction spasm of the 1920s. This large book, 19 by 12 inches in size, elegantly designed, beautifully printed, is today rarely available. Even the end papers, which you see on the right, were spectacular. Dozens of entries, most of them high rises from the mid-20s, and I show you a sort of opening of the book, found their way into Chicago apartments. Why were so many created in just 6 or 7 years? For several reasons. First, prime sites were suddenly available for development. Investors like the Potter Palmer and Edith Rockefeller McCormick interests were seeking better return on capital. Mansions dating to the late 19th century were coming on the market, and some major estates were broken up. Rising land values made it attractive for these homeowners or their heirs to start unloading their property to syndicates. Secondly, transportation and park improvements, notably extension of the Lakeshore Drive, ultimately, of course, running south beyond 67th Street and north with the expansion of Lincoln Park, reduced travel times and offered park front aprons to many buildings. Third, Chicago's first zoning ordinance, which raised height restrictions. Fourth, technological innovations and building code changes, which increased the efficiency of construction. Fifth, sharp increases in the cost of living after World War I, which combined with immigration restriction to create a domestic service crisis for the upper middle classes, making apartment house and residential hotel life far more appealing. And finally, a new form of financing, which would allow a new kind of building to flourish. And here you can see how rapid this all was. 18 years from those two lonely buildings on East Lakeshore Drive to the East Lakeshore Drive that we know. 18 years, which sees this remarkable shift. The final reason that I just mentioned, this new form of financing led to the cooperative, which flourished in Chicago in the 20s in both 100% and partial forms. Most of the 20s buildings in our book were cooperatives, often financed by bank-issued bonds, usually bearing a picture of the proposed building and its specifications. Sold one by one, buyers purchased shares of the equity and a percentage of the large mortgages owed to the bank. Taxes and building expenses were met by assessments. Described in great detail, cooperative developers promised that building materials and amenities would be of high quality as they were intended for owner occupants. The cooperatives hugged the lake from South Shore to Edgewater, many of them designed by the prolific Robert S. DeGaudier, who had worked as a chief designer in Benjamin Marshall's office until 1916. And DeGaudier is really the best represented architect in our book, responsible for 13 buildings. Unlike Marshall, formerly trained as an architect at MIT, and a strong supporter of classical principles in building planning. It was DeGaudier who broke the mold on the north side in 1925 when he completed 1120 North Lakeshore Drive, which at 18 stories towered above the apartment buildings some by Marshall that were nearby, and in early photographs stands like a giant among pygmies. Dressed in Gothic details, and that peaked roof really was designed to hide the tanks and penthouses that disfigured a number of apartment house roofs in days before. Dressed in these details, which were a favorite stylistic choice for DeGaulier, but he also built in Romanesque, he built in Neoclassic, he built in French Classic. He was a whiz at interior layouts, one reason for his popularity. The apartments here at 1120 began at around $12,000 or $13,000 to buy. Again, you have to multiply by more than 20 to get the values of our own day. This building also contained a garage. DeGaulier soon exceeded this height when he designed a 25-story building a few blocks to the north, 1430 North Lakeshore Drive, and it was on the site of the James Deering House, which came down to permit this building to be constructed. It was only 45 feet wide, an exercise in Tudor Gothic, and apparently swayed a bit in those early years. And moreover, the developer, W.C. Bannerman, who had worked with DeGaulier on many apartment projects, turned out to be a crook. He created dummy corporations, inflated costs, received kickbacks, and stole shares. And even before the crash, Bannerman was declared insolvent. However, the 1420 building, 1430 building still stands, and just to its south, bolstering it, is 1430. And here you can see a rendering to the right. And this was how people were introduced to these buildings during the 1920s by sketches done by architectural renderers in the weekend editions of the Chicago Tribune. Both 1420 and 1430 still survive. DeGaulier also built several structures on the south side. One of them, which you see here, 5000 East End, remained the tallest building south of the Loop until after World War II. It opened as the first of 5 East Park apartment high-rises on the former grounds of the old Chicago Beach Hotel. And here you can see the 2 Chicago beaches here, this of the later version. Chicago Beach owned the riparian rights, the land that bordered the lakefront. And after landfill, a whole new neighborhood was created here. 5000 East and Tudor Gothic was a standard issue by this time, but another DeGaulier building, just half a block away, was very different. Its associate architect was Charles Morgan, a modernist and a noted draftsman whose renderings of new buildings were frequently exposed on the pages of the Chicago Tribune. But Morgan was a modernist, and the child of the DeGaulier-Morgan partnership was the Powhatan, a colorful, deco-inspired, reinforced concrete structure that incorporated a Parisian aesthetic inflected with Native American themes. And the Powhatan really is, to some extent, a child of the 1925 Art Deco exposition in Paris, particularly in its remarkable elevator cabs, which you see here with their wonderful wood and the Edgar Brandt inspired metalwork. The Powhatan was likened to an ocean liner, partly because it had, along with one other DeGaulier building, 3750 North Lakeshore Drive, its own indoor swimming pool. Morgan designed the details and the building's clean, modern lines, which some saw as influenced by Elio Saarinen's second place entry in the Chicago Tribune competition a few years earlier. DeGaulier again did the interior layouts. Meanwhile, the parade of great buildings along East and North Lakeshore Drive and on Lakeview continued. One of the most ambitious came with the 1929 completion of 1500 North Lakeshore Drive, which required destroying the mansion of Victor Lawson, who is the publisher of the Chicago Daily News. McNally and Quinn were the architects of record, but there was a hefty New York influence here, particularly the planning assistance of Rosario Candela. many of the owners brought in their own architects to design the interiors of their residences. And these owners included William Wrigley Jr. and banker George Woodruff, who occupied the 18-room bungalow that sits atop the building. Photographed by Hedrick Blessing, this was one of the city's most lavish interiors. Its baronial style featured paneling, a great hall, and distinctive his and her bathrooms, one finished in Renaissance style, the other in the more masculine Pompeian. Thanks to a recent sales opportunity, we can see what the apartment looks like today. Some changes, of course, took place, but not so many that obscured the originals. And with drone help, we can see the bungalow and the garden as no one in those days actually could. The Woodruffs enjoyed the roof of one of the city's tallest apartment houses and had their own Mediterranean garden to look out from. Banker Woodruff's fortunes did not survive the crash. He sold supposedly for a song, but unlike many other cooperatives, 1500 escaped insolvency and remains today a cooperative. The Woodruff interiors are one of many we were able to document through period photographs. And our book tried to recover what the apartments looked like, reflecting owner taste and the earlier generations of interior designers. On the south side, Jackson Towers, facing today's Museum of Science and Industry, sported its own elaborate duplexes, stepping out of 16th century Spain or 20th century Hollywood. Huge fireplaces, scattered coats of arms, stuccoed walls, all made the point. Meanwhile, on streets just west of Lakeshore Drive, on Cedar and Walton and Delaware, came other impressive structures. 20 East Cedar is distinctive because of its two-story duplexes. Its construction, however, bankrupted the developer, Harold Bradley, who is the co-author of that early apartment house guide. 900 North Michigan, which no longer survives in its 1920s form, contained on its lower floors fabulous interiors created for Cyrus McCormick, one of the developers. State and Astor Street hosted smaller versions, and 1260 and 1301 Astor, both limestone-clad deco buildings by Philip Mayer, contained simplex and duplex flats. In the case of 1301, a triplex belonging to the Potter Palmers. These apartments attracted some of Chicago's most prominent interior architect designers, like Elsie Cobb Wilson, Francis Elkins, Philip Mayer, the architect himself, David Adler, and Paul Schweiker. The early residents included Art Institute benefactors like Potter Palmer, Robert Allerton, and Frederick Clay Bartlett, as well as the architect John Welborn Root Jr. Several of the residents expressed their taste for the modern in some remarkable rooms. Further north, the sale of large estates and the demolition of family mansions meant more development opportunities. 399 West Fullerton was one of several large apartment buildings erected on the former Nellie Loeb estate. She belonged to the Bush family of St. Louis, the great brewers, and this area, in fact, had a number of brewing families living there. Peter Reynolds, a developer of 1500 Lakeshore Drive, had a hand in this 16-story building, which claimed in its brochure to be available only to families of recognized social and financial standing. And here I show you again one of the floor plans, this time in English. It stood perpendicular and just to the south of three luxury buildings on Lakeview, erected at about the same time, 2430, 2440, and 2450 Lakeview. 2430 is almost entirely duplex. Many of the residents favored Georgian details. These 14-room apartments soon housed a group of prominent families, including those of its architect, Andrew Rabori, and the Goodspeeds, Charles and Bobsey Goodspeed, who, among other things, hosted part of Gertrude Stein's famous visit to Chicago in the 1930s. David Adler designed their apartment, providing extraordinary detailing. Each duplex included a graceful staircase connecting the two floors. Just to the north is 2440, begun the year after 2430 had been completed. A partial co-op, many of the 107 units served as rentals to support building costs, but it collapsed as a co-op during the Great Depression. Reborn in 1950, as many residents bought apartments in the reorganized building. Just to its north was 2450, designed by Howard Van Doren Shaw a few years earlier. Shaw had planned 1130 Lakeshore Drive, but he moved here for his last years. At least 4 Art Institute trustees lived at 2450 in the 20s, among them Charles Hutchinson and Kate Buckingham, who incorporated part of her father's Prairie Avenue home within her apartment. And here, the interior for John McCutcheon, the great Tribune cartoonist. These 5 bedrooms, full 4 units rival in size the East Lakeshore Drive buildings. More grand apartments from the 20s can be found as we move along Lakeshore Drive northward, some of them at 3750 and 3800, towering structures with gables, chimneys, oriels, and in the case of 3750, another DeGolyer building, an indoor swimming pool. And here you can see the brochure for 3800. These, along with many others the book describes, which I have to omit for time's sake, are described and illustrated until the northern border of our book, at least, the Edgewater Beach at 5555 Sheridan is reached. Once part of a considerable recreational complex, 3 buildings, and a summer resort, golf, tennis, big band, dance music, just 15 minutes from downtown. This complex attracted tourists and conventioneers. The apartment building was the final part of this compound, cleverly arranged by Marshall to cut down the length of hall corridors and maximize light and air for the 16 apartments planned on each floor. There were 300 apartments in all, and the Edgewater Beach still contains its own shops, pool, and exercise rooms. And here I must end the 20s survey, reminding you again that many of the buildings that I've just described went up in a rather frenzied 6 or 7 year period. They epitomized the interwar ideal of luxury. Lavish, often uniformed support staff, large rooms, formal dining rooms, high ceilings, butlers' pantries, paneling, libraries, cedar closets, commodious kitchens, servants' quarters, customized interiors with tradition-laden details outside, paneled libraries inside, separate passenger and service elevators, restricted to people of a certain social class and ethnicity. They contained apartments of the same size range. They emphasized privacy, and wherever possible, they offered lake views. Dramatic staircases for the duplexes added to the allure. This was luxury as the city's elite, its privileged upper and upper middle class defined it. The Great Depression, of course, forced it to a sudden halt. What followed was the Great Hiatus. For 25 years or so, luxury building, in fact, almost all tall building, went into basically total eclipse. Architects like DeGolyer sought work from the federal government. He, in fact, helped plan the Pentagon. Others designed federal housing projects. These 2 photographs, a decade apart, show Chicago's skyline as basically static and unchanging. Developers turned to other things. Buildings went bankrupt, unable to pay off their bonds. speculative investors took over much that remained. Recovery began in the 50s and 60s. One early entry on the south side was the Promontory Apartments by Mies van der Rohe, offering middle-class access to the lakefront at 22 stories with lake views and modern conveniences, a cooperative at affordable prices. Soon thereafter came the famous Mies glass houses on the north side, iconic and highly influential, modern inside and out. Outer Drive East and Marina City were not far behind. These buildings, familiar to all of you, are described in the book. And there was exultation at the height of these buildings. Here you can see people enjoying the views from the new Marina City in 1963 after it had opened. There were others, of course, 1040 North Lakeshore Drive, Carlisle, introducing more lavishly designed interiors, larger interiors. And as the 70s begin, Lake Point Tower, the John Hancock, become available. Much larger than their 20s counterparts, both in floors and numbers of units. They were increasingly condominiums, the Illinois Act passed in the late 60s, rather than cooperatives. And the floor plans tended to be more constricted in room size, number, and ceiling height. I show you just a few examples here very quickly, reproduced in the book. A few of them, Lake Point Tower, for example, exploited building technology to offer expansive spaces, but these were on the whole much smaller. More typically, time rather than space had become the crucial commodity, meaning efficiency of maintenance and self-sustaining amenities for exercising, for shopping, for cleaning, for parking, temperature control. All of these were major elements of a luxurious lifestyle. Luxury meant efficiency as well as display, and stylistically was flavored by post-war modernism, minimalist in character, and decoratively restrained. Servants' rooms waned along with servants. Microwaves, frozen foods, delivered foods, fast foods shrunk the kitchens, butler's pantries disappeared. Silver storage, fur vaults, crystal and china cabinets, beamed ceilings, fireplaces, they tended to disappear as well, replaced by large windows, compact kitchens, central air, bigger closets. These trends were documented by our 2004 book, but not long after that, luxury building was interrupted again. The Great Recession of 2008-9 sunk many schemes and soured banks on condominiums. Some feared a catastrophe approaching the levels of the Depression. But Chicago's recovery, now often with rentals, came more quickly than expected. And with it, large self-contained complexes boasting elaborate amenities. Parts of Chicago blossomed with projects, some distant from the lakefront, but others battening off of downtown attractions, newly created, like Millennium Park, for example. While lake views became even more remarkable, the river, enhanced and alive day and night with the River Walk, became a particular asset. All this seemed to Terry and me worth noticing. So we have 14 new entries in this edition, most completed within the last 5 or 10 years, and a couple that we somehow missed the first time round. We added some period photographs and commissioned some new ones, and in one case, actually included a building that was never built, just one. And I start there with, as I say, the only building that was never constructed. It climaxed many trends of the previous 2 decades and foretold tastes that would become dominant in the years that followed. This was Santiago Calatrava's much loved or hated Chicago Spire, designed and redesigned in the heady years between 2005 and 7 just before the crash. Some may remember the elaborate promotional campaigns for the Spire, the amazing floor of model apartments in the NBC buildings, and the printed brochure. The Spire was on the cusp of two merchandising eras, one of the last buildings to commission truly elegant printed literature, but also to make use of new technologies. Even the end papers of this brochure were spectacular, and we incorporated them in the book. Developer Garrett Kelleher and architect Calatrava had extraordinary ambitions, and the engineering of this building was astonishing. Sales offices opened in 14 cities, Dublin, Moscow, Seoul, and Hong Kong among them. This was when Chicago hoped to land those Olympic Games that would ultimately, with mixed results, go to Rio de Janeiro. The brochure describes the city as the world's 19th largest economy. It claimed 4 states were visible from the higher floors, almost 1,200 apartments in the 150 stories. The 7-sided building would have a 15,000 square foot, 52-foot high lobby, 17 elevators, storage for 400 bicycles, a teen interactive center, rock climbing, massage room, movie theaters. The amenities went on. And of course, it would regenerate DuSable Park. Best of all were Calatrava's ingenious interior spaces, ranging from 534 square foot studios to a 6,500 square foot penthouse. And I show you the spacious floor plan of the penthouse, which actually sold for $40 million. But it was these smaller apartments that amazed visitors. Hidden hardware turned these tiny studios into spacious living areas. The structure, in short, was transformational in scale and detail, and we wanted to document its enormous range of apartment sizes, its residential amenities, and its surrounding park anticipated the trends that many other buildings would quickly follow. You all know the sad end of the Spire. 30% of its apartments were sold, but the crash melted the financing. And despite several recent proposals, the foundation hole is a hole, and the future of the site is not absolutely clear yet. But the 12 years following brought other grand structures, several included in our new edition. To start with, Jeannie Gang's Aqua, whose dynamic sculpture facade made a huge impression here and nationally. Completed about the time of the financial collapse, after some delays, it mingled a hotel, rentals, and condominiums, a blend other buildings would maintain, and it's a detail of the Aqua that adorns our dust trap. At 82 stories, Aqua became one of the tallest of this new generation, although it gives way to the considerably higher Vista Towers just being completed. Rather different in plan and outline, Vista also contains the characteristic features of the contemporary super tall apartment residence, a surrounding park, a vast array of amenities, a broad range of apartment sizes. And like Aqua, it has a strong sculptural presence, its flowing curves challenging the more angular geometry of most of its recent predecessors. Like Aqua, it privileges river views along with the lake and the city. And river views are also privileged by Grinnell on the River, the name of the building, which we include as well in the new edition. Big, but not quite as big as Aqua or Vista, is the Legacy, exploiting the completed vision of Millennium Park. Its connection with the University Club, along with its Jewelers Row profile on Wabash, just to the west, and here you can see the view from the west, connects 3 eras of Chicago architecture: modernism, neo-Gothic, and 19th century commercial. And they make for a rather remarkable summary of the city's built landscape. Other new buildings invoke the 1920s and 30s stand out. Some revel in older touches like Lucien Lagrange's mansarded 2550 Lakeview, one of the French-inspired structures that he has created in Chicago. 2550 abuts on an easily accessible chapel, which honors Mother Cabrini, whose hospital once stood on this site. And it features an elaborate garden designed by the New York landscaper, Thomas Balsley. Another popular trope of today, the surrounding or neighboring garden, is also exemplified by the Van Valkenburg Park, which is attached to One Bennett Park's Grand Avenue mix of condominiums and rentals. Here you can see the park, which is partially open to the public. And here is Robert A.M. Stern's building in a sketch. The building had not been completed before we had our book finished. Some new boutique structures in more contemporary style capture the scale and economic homogeneity of older buildings. Thus, we included Larry Booth's 30 West Oak, and as well some of its contemporary interiors. Just a few blocks south is the even newer 9 Walton, also by present standards, a smaller building. Both demonstrate the continuing appeal of this near north area, but they are definitely outnumbered by colossal counterparts, like Raphael Vignoli's Anima, opened on Roosevelt Road, opened just this past year. This is the only exclusively rental building added to the book, with claims to be the tallest rental building in the city. It and its neighbors to the east help define a giant C made up of Roosevelt Road, Michigan Avenue, and the buildings paralleling Randolph. Millennium Park's a giant stage set, its landscaping and its activities shift attention again away from the limitless horizon of Lake Michigan. Luxury is power and power is control, and they are expressed symbolically as well as practically in details as well as writ large. And I conclude with a dramatic shift in bathrooms. Those 1920s buildings express their luxury in opulent, colorful details like the Woodruff extravaganza that I showed earlier. Those 2 bathrooms at 1500 Lakeshore Drive featured an elaborate eclecticism. Today, it's rather different. A rather stark simplicity has replaced them, along with the crucial addition of stunning views, both exemplified in this penthouse bathroom perched high in the Legacy, just next to its own sauna. Bathing with the city surrounding you, separated only by a thin wall of glass, securely hidden, yet dramatically exposed. 2 versions of luxury, each reflecting distinct conceptions of privilege, power, and comfort. And this is where I stop. What Chicago's luxury housing will look like in another 16 years, in 2036, if someone creates a 3rd edition of this book, we don't know. Will computers and robots further transform daily apartment life? Will new parts of the city be colonized from these buildings? Will they create more private parks? Will condominiums disappear? No one knows, but views, opulence, and unexpected amenities should all continue to be part of their future development. And this is where I'm going to stop and return with Terry to answer your questions. And I'm going to go out of screen sharing, if I can figure out how to do it. Stop share. No, it's okay. I think we are back, and Terry's going to join me. And
Thank you,
Scott, your you're going to be fielding questions or comments as our conversation begins. Let's see.
Great. Wonderful presentation, Neil.
Thank you. And Terry is going to be, you sit down. I'll move.
I've got one question so far. In the light of the COVID pandemic, which has led to likely permanent remote working for many, for many, do you think it will lead to reduced demand and construction of apartment buildings
Yes, go ahead.
in light of
Well,
COVID? Yeah.
This is just a moment in a long history. It may conceivably, historians, someone said, only predict the past. They don't predict the future. So I don't know what will happen in days to come. Obviously, the pandemic has put a crimp in many plans. But I think the features of these buildings, their proximity to the advantages that city life offers, suggest that they will be around for some time and that new ones will continue to be added. Perhaps not at the same rate. It's hard to say, but I think one doesn't want to generalize on the basis of a year or two or even 5 or 10.
Thank you. Oh, can I also just ask people to ask their questions in the Q&A button instead of the chat? We'll just keep it a little more organized for me. I have one comment here in the chat that was, would you please comment on the Edgewater Beach apartments? The apartments are very different from the luxury apartments. For whom were they intended, and what lifestyle was Marshall creating?
Well, I think the Edgewater Beach can be understood as a kind of hotel apartment house on a grand scale. These were people who wanted their own apartments, and they have full kitchens. They're not on the same scale as, let's say, the Marshall buildings on East Lakeshore Drive, but they were able to incorporate the amenities that the residents wanted. There were a lot of services. There were shops.
A restaurant.
Yes.
I think in certain cases, in a certain way, the Edgewater Beach anticipates the definition of luxury that changed when this new edition of the book came out. A number of the buildings, the new buildings in the book, are apartments are very, very costly, but they do not have the space of the earlier apartments. They do not have things like separate dining rooms, or in some cases even separate kitchens. But they do have a tremendous number of amenities that has in some ways now made those apartments more desirable than the most luxurious buildings of Chicago's past, like 209 East Lakeshore Drive and the buildings on East Lakeshore Drive.
A good point. I've seen some of the amenities in these apartment buildings. It makes me want to live there.
Yeah.
Also, that leads to another question in the chat box was, and are old buildings being torn down or restored? And I know that many are being restored. And I'm sure you have some comments on that as well.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting paradox or almost reversal. In my view, the Condominium Act saved many of the older buildings by reintroducing ownership where people could own their apartments outright. And that led to a lot of investment in the restoration and renovation of these buildings. We live in one of these buildings. It's very expensive to keep on fixing the old pipes and the electrical systems, et cetera, et cetera. And some condominiums are now reverting to renter status. They're being bought out by investors because they require a huge investment to bring their basic systems up to grade. It's you may want to.
Well, Neil mentioned in his talk that when we did the new addition, we had to eliminate a small number of buildings to make room for, even though the new book is bigger than the old, we still had to eliminate some things. And one of the buildings that was in the original edition of the book has now not only moved from being a condominium to being a rental building, but the large apartments that had originally been in that building have now been chopped up into very, very tiny rental apartments. And that was one of the buildings that we took out from the first edition to the second.
And this happened during the Depression and the years that followed in some buildings as well. But in the case of one or two buildings that we had originally included, the shift was very dramatic. And so that's a part of the future that one has to acknowledge may pose some challenges.
Do you have any opinion of the Tribune Tower residences? I don't know if those are complete yet. Is that in your book?
No. Well, we had an experience in our first edition. We had one building and we showed the plans.
Yes.
And we included the plans, but it didn't happen. So we decided we would not put a building in unless it was really almost completed. And with the Tribune, that development took place after. I haven't seen the plans. It's going to, I'm sure, be a spectacular structure, but I don't know what the interior arrangements will be like.
Another question, I think someone wanted to know the name of the woman architect you mentioned in your presentation, and are there any other prominent women architects in Chicago that are building high rises? I know you mentioned Jeannie Gang.
Jeannie Gang is, I think, stands out. This area was dominated by men. Some of the architectural firms had architects who were super salesmen, and although they had design ideas, their work came primarily in persuading developers to back them, and that was a male-dominated field.
There are a number of women who were involved in these buildings by designing individual apartments. Margaret McCurry is a name that springs to mind.
Frances Elkins.
Frances Elkins was a designer with her brother David Adler of important apartments in 1301 North Astor, for example. But Jeannie Gang is the only woman to be the architect of the entire building. Although I will add that unlike an architect like Robert DeGolyer, that Jeannie Gang designs the outside of the building. She does not do the interior arrangement of the apartments.
As far as we know.
As far as we know. I mean, we've been told that about several of her buildings, that aspect of design and construction is done by another firm.
It's broken down. I should mention Carol Ross Barney, who of course designed the Riverwalk, and that is a sort of horizontal skyscraper, you could argue, in some ways, and does interact with these tall buildings. The new areas of the city that have opened up to these buildings is one of the fascinating meta narratives, I think, that one can talk about.
Another question, given the current pace of development, do you foresee any future corrections as we saw in 2007, 2008?
Well, I think that's, again, up for grabs. We don't know how soon we're coming out of this. These crises appear to be recurring in shorter intervals. We came out of the last one more quickly than many people expected us to. Whether we will come out of this one as quickly or not, it's just very hard to say. We have huge new government outlays coming up, supposedly big infrastructural investments, but a lot of that depends on political will. And I think it's it's very hard. It's very hard to make predictions in the short run. We are committed to urban living and to urban sites, so we hope that the recovery will come quickly, but there's no basis on which to offer reassurance, I'm afraid.
Now, you mentioned the changing of the condo laws that created, ownership of these units. What's your view on that, on that legislation and its nature of ownership in the maintenance of older buildings? And I think in New York, there's a lot of co-ops rather than condos.
Correct.
Right.
It's a mystery as to why New York has retained the cooperative form so much more powerfully than Chicago. It may go back. I mean, cooperatives are a way of controlling entry into the building, and they were used that way to exclude people, often not financial exclusion, although that was part of it, but ethnic and religious and racial exclusion. And in New York, many New York apartment cooperatives have been proverbially difficult to enter.
In Chicago, however, that's now illegal. You cannot exclude people really except on the basis of that they can't financially participate in the cooperative. But in New York, that doesn't seem to be exactly the case, but I don't know that much about New York other than, rumor and innuendo about things like that.
Well, in the New York apartment costs are so on the top, are so staggeringly different from Chicago that it's hard to make comparison. I think condominiums offered people, middle and upper middle class people, a chance to have their own place, to have a mortgage. Also, condominium boards are, I think, less powerful than cooperative boards in some respects. As a cooperative member, you don't own your property. You own a share in a building, and it's governed by a corporate board, as it were. Anyway, I'm sort of drifted away from the camera. But the reason why New York never went condominium, I don't fully understand. May have to do with banks, loans. Again, at one time, cooperative transactions were all cash. You didn't get mortgages on cooperatives. That has changed. So here we're into an area not of architecture, but of financing.
Do you think, this is probably another one along those lines. Do these older buildings represent a historical asset class that will appreciate or increase over time?
Yes, well, one hopes, as long as investment is maintained. And this, of course, is the problem. If maintenance is deferred, and no one likes to see assessments go up, it's tempting to put things down the road. If they are deferred, then the costs multiply, and you have huge figures, possibly more than you paid for your apartment, confronting you to keep the building functioning properly. In some ways, these apartment buildings are wonderfully efficient, but in other ways, they are very expensive.
I have a question about Edmund Krauss. One of the attendees mentioned they're aware of his 1550 North LaSalle building from around 1898. Are you familiar with Edmund Krauss?
I've come across the name, but I'm not really familiar. And we didn't do very much too far west. We went as far west as Astor, but we didn't move far from the lakefront in looking at the buildings that we included, except when we moved along a bit along the river. So I can't really comment on that. I don't know that building.
I'll answer just a few more. We still have a number of questions here, but we're running kind of late here. For one Lakeshore Drive residents, you mentioned how Wrigley Jr., et cetera, had personal architects for their personal unit interiors.
Yes.
How common is that still?
Oh, I think for expensive buildings, it's not uncommon. People bring in their own designers. They refigured the walls. 1500 was notable because apparently almost every apartment had its own architect, and it was really they're remarkably different. But that still happens, and we had photographs in the first edition of some very modern apartments, which were done by separate architects separate from the building architects, who constructed what the owners wanted. If it's your apartment, presumably you can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want, as long as you don't damage any structural issues.
I think it was extremely common in the past, and I think it will remain extremely common. It's like these apartments are so expensive. It's when you buy one of these apartments, it's as if you're buying a new house. And just as when people buy a new house, they want the kitchen to be different, they want this to be organized in a different way, the same thing happens in the interior of these apartments on this scale.
And in some cases, we know people who have moved out of their apartments for a year while they redid it to their particular specifications. We also have changing needs. I guess our current system of communication and presentation is leading people to work toward larger screens and rooms which are more amenable to this kind of demonstration.
Here's a good one. Is there room in today's construction and economic conditions for classical design to happen at the scale of the pre-war apartment buildings displayed in your books?
Well, I think, yes, depending upon the reputation of the architect. And of course, it depends what one is using the term classical, what exactly that means. Something with 22-story columns with Corinthian, capitals on top. No, that's not going to happen. But I will mention, for example, 2550 North Lakeview, one of the new buildings in the book, designed by Lucien Lagrange, isn't classical in the ancient architecture sense of classical, but it very much looks towards those classic buildings of France and changes it to put it on a grand scale. And that building, we're told by many people, is one of the most attractive buildings to move into in the city of Chicago. So it's by no means a modernist building. So I think that there is room for something like that.
And then again, people do their interiors in ways that are very different from the building exteriors. When you look at the way some very modern buildings have been furnished by those who move in them, you say there's a total disconnect, as it were. But there's a lot of comfort attached to traditional decor, furniture, and arrangements. That has remained despite a series of dramatic revolutions over the course of the 20th and 21st century in exterior design. So I think classical traditions and principles will continue to exert themselves in one way or another in interiors and even exteriors.
Great. Jane, did you have something else to add to say? You're on mute, but.
Unmute, here we go. Well, there's so much to say, and it was an amazing, in the end, brief tour of Chicago. I do want to hold up the book. I do want you to buy this book. You will love this book. I love this book. And I love his Neil's first book, and all that Terry has contributed to it. I want to thank Scott also, for this wonderful collaboration. But I will say something about Lucien Lagrange, who was our first honorary chair when we started the society in 2002. He came on, I think, in 2003, very bravely, because, no one knew Benjamin Marshall hardly at that time, it seemed, or certainly had forgotten who he was. And Lucien told me at that time that Benjamin Marshall was his greatest influence. So I think we can still see that when we look at his work today, and including the Park Hyatt and some of his other wonderful buildings. So there is a place for classical architecture, although our wonderful Blair Kamen doesn't feel that it's, that this changes or adds something, particularly exciting to Chicago. But I love that. I love his work. And anyway, I want to thank you all, and thank you for people following us on the Benjamin Marshall Society, and thank you for the collaboration. And also, I just want to say that Scott Fortman is a great architect. Great architect. I've seen his work. I love his work, and I'm just delighted to be collaborating with ICAA. Thank you.
Thank you. And,
Thank you again.
and thanks to Julie Hayes for her work on setting us all up.
We couldn't do it without Julie putting this all together for us. Thank you.
Oh,
And then one other thing is, you can find the book at where? At the Seminary Co-op.
We're Seminary Co-op, as many of you know, is one of the greatest bookstores in the United States, and we're really passionate about supporting them. They've been going through a hard time as everything else. Neil and I go to their parking lot periodically, and we sign inscribed books to people. So if you can buy this book, obviously many other places, but if you do want a copy simply signed by us, you can buy it from Seminary. If you want it personally inscribed, if you state that on the Seminary website, when we go to sign books, they'll give us a little chit of paper so that we can sign it to people. So we're grateful for support of Seminary, because they're very much deserving of that.
Great.
great.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Have a
to-
nice evening. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Good night.